creators and disruptors meet. LA Live with Ron Colbert takes you inside the minds of entrepreneurs, artists, and technologists. Subscribe and like now.
I'm here with John Wooler. You have an interesting history in music with very talented people in the music industry. People need to really reach out to do something extraordinary. I think you've done it.
I was raised and grew up in Scotland, and I always had this sort of passion to be involved in the music industry. But I realized that it wasn't going to happen in Scotland. I was going to have to move to London to pursue my interests, which I did. And I was lucky enough to get involved in the industry. I was working for the BBC to start as a music researcher. I originally went down there to try and make it, quote unquote, as a musician, but failed. But enjoyed playing music as a hobby, but was thankful that I could actually make a living out of the business side of it. So started at the BBC, and then I was involved in booking bands for different music shows for television. And that's how I got to know all the record labels. And through the labels, got an opportunity to join Virgin Records in the A&R department, artists and repertoire. And I was there for over 20 years and then went on to do various other things.
Johnny Winter and Isaac Hayes. Was there a changing point when you went through that?
Yeah, I mean, I started off signing mainstream acts for Virgin. It was very sort of mainstream orientated, which was standard. You signed bands that could get on the radio in the UK. But I was fortunate enough to be working on a project by Gary Moore, Still Got the Blues, in the late 80s, 89. And at that time, you know, major labels weren't signing blues acts. It didn't seem to be commercially viable. But Gary had a huge success as a rock artist within Lizzie and different groups. So they allowed him to do this record. And at the same time, I was kind of pitching myself to my boss at the time, the president of Virgin, to sort of set up a subsidiary label focusing on roots music, whether it be blues or rhythm and blues. And thankfully for me, the Gary Moore album that I worked on went on to be really successful. It did about 4 million albums, which gave sort of credibility that you could actually sell roots music to a wider audience.
What was the influence of that inspiration? What was to understand that, to see that, to envision?
It was his idea. Gary Moore was managed by a guy called Clifford Davis, who managed Fleetwood Mac back in the 60s. Gary was very close with Peter Green, and Clifford Davis brought Gary over from Ireland. So it was kind of his concept to do a kind of a Fleetwood Mac early blues album. But they knew that I was involved in that style of music as a fan, so I was put together with that project to help bring in other artists and actually work on material as well. So it gave me inspiration that you could basically record roots music and it cross over to a large audience if the songs were there. Plus, Gary did have a bass; he had a big bass to work from. But it kind of gave me momentum to sort of say that, you know, if you got the right artist, there was potential to still sell records in that style of music. So working with the likes of Johnny Winter and Isaac Hayes, etc., was really working with some of my heroes. I got to work with people that I admired as a fan growing up, that I felt that I could get involved with and hopefully give them an opportunity to come back. So it was kind of going to these guys and sort of convincing them that this could be an opportunity, signing to me through Virgin to sort of push their career back on track, shall we say.
Ocean Way Studios. What was that moment in history for you?
I mean, it was a legendary studio in LA that, you know, many mainstream big acts had worked at. The rooms were fantastic. So it was a perfect studio to work in if you were trying to record artists as sort of a collective. In other words, you set up the band live in the big room and try and record a lot of the tracks to keep that kind of authentic performance. So it was just a great experience. It was a great, you know, historic studio, great equipment, great gear. But more importantly, you could record the kind of records I was doing quickly and efficiently because you could set up in that big room and sort of almost record it live and then do overdubs. So it was just great.
What are your thoughts on moving forward? Because for me as a techie, I'm excited every day, but I think definitely there's a switch to this tech world that really everybody needs to embrace.
You need technology, and it's a way that everyone accesses content now, whatever that content may be. The problem for the musician is its saturation. Now it's changed the dynamic of how artists are promoted. You know, you've got to really do a lot of searching to find anything new because of the volume. And I think, you know, you just have to be aware that, you know, all companies now, the first thing they do is look at data and stats. You know, in the old days, you'd look at how good is the music, what's the potential of the artist, what's the long-term potential, what's the development, and there'd be a financial investment in that. Nowadays, it's all about stats. If you're not streaming millions of streams, if you don't have a massive Instagram profile or TikTok,
You need to build it. So
you need to build
gotta,
it. But you're talking
but
millions.
you're talking. People are getting lost in that world of trying to build something. It's extremely entrepreneurial.
Right, because the labels won't do it for you. So they're basically picking up content that's already gaining traction. They're not picking up artists as we would do that never made a record, and we were listening to demos and we would build from there. Now they're looking for artists that's already built a big social media following or built credibility by releasing their own records. But you've got to be doing millions and millions of streams before they even pay attention, because for them, they look at that as there's an existing audience. You know, in the industry, anyone that's working with media, we had to sign agreements with all the labels basically stating that can't use any of their music as a source for AI in terms of building tracks from that. So there's a lot of issues with that. It's great, and AI is fantastic, but there's a downside. It's got to come from a source, though, and that's what.
Yeah, but we all get inspired. The computer's getting inspired.
A lot of positives as well about AI. You know, definitely in terms of learning,
Independence, freedom. Really,
Yeah, I mean,
to create your own studio. I mean, at the end of the day, having your own studio is how you don't have to depend on anybody else.
Industry is changing so quickly, you know, whether it be TV, film, music, that if you don't keep up, you're just going to get left behind for sure.
John Hammond, tell me about that story.
So John, I got to meet him through his manager and agent. Just, you know, he's been around for a long time, and, you know, his father is sad because everyone wants to talk about John Hammond Sr. as opposed to John Hammond. John Hammond Sr. was an executive at Columbia. He was the guy that was bringing Robert Johnson to New York to record. He signed Aretha Franklin to the gospel label. He signed Bruce Springsteen. He signed Bob Dylan. He signed Stevie Ray Vaughan. So everyone, first time poor John would get interviewed, it's like, tell me about your dad. His mother was also a Vanderbilt, so he'd be going to school in a limousine. So John at 17 decided that he didn't want to be associated with his father, didn't really have a good relationship with his father, and wanted to sort of prove that he could go out on his own. But I got to meet John. He was a fantastic guy, and he's probably one of the best exponents of sort of Delta blues, acoustic guitars. He's a real, you know, he's an incredible musician, whether it be electric music or acoustic. So he's one of these guys that's just made a living out of touring and being very consistent. And, you know, he was a great artist to work with. And we worked with him and J.G. Cale, and Tom Waits did a record with him. The great thing about these guys is they like to record quickly and efficiently live. They were not into being in the studio for weeks on end. They wanted to get in, get out quickly. But they could do that because of their ability as a musician. You know, they could play. The takes were really good first time. Maybe you did a second take or third take, but that would be it. And it was all about performance. So they knew that, you know, they were going to give you the best early on. It wasn't going to be overdubs. I wish I had my iPhone back in the day. I would have had some amazing pictures and footage. Sadly not. No, it was great. I mean, watching any of these guys. But I mean, I was lucky growing up, you know, with Virgin, where you'd be in sessions almost every day, witnessing really good producers and artists, how they work. You learn a lot just sitting in the room.
The love of music, man, come on. That is, seriously, that's why anybody gravitates to it. And then when you can learn the business.
When you were working with an artist, you had to oversee the business side. You know, you signed an artist, you had to do the budgets, you had to manage that. You were involved in the contractual side. And frankly, you weren't going to last long as an A&R guy if you weren't signing bands that made money. You could sign bands that you loved, that you felt had commercial potential, but you wouldn't sign bands that you loved that didn't have commercial potential.
There's definitely a divide
There's
there.
a big divide. Well, you know, again, you always want to sign something that you believed in, that you could see the potential, but you had to feel they had that radio potential, because that was the only way you could really break a lot of artists back in the UK was radio. So if there wasn't that kind of radio sound, There had to be another angle to the artist. With major labels, their job was to sell records. So you had to really learn the difference between what was commercially viable and great and what was great that wasn't commercially viable. And when I worked at the BBC, I could sign bands to do a TV performance, and I didn't have to worry if they sold music or not. I just thought they're great to have on the show. You didn't have to worry about the sales potential. But when you moved to a label, you did have to worry about that.
Look back to when you first started and you go, okay, I see some money.
Great example, Tina Turner. She came over to work with a guy called Martin Ware at Heaven 17. This is probably back in like 82, 83. She just did the Mad Max movie. And I went to see her back then. And Martin Ware was doing a kind of a concept record of soul music. And he invited her to come and do a version, I think, of Help or Let's Stay Together. And EMI, and Martin Ware was a very successful producer at the time. So they signed Tina on a singles deal where basically there was only a contractual commitment to put out a couple of tracks with an option to do an album if something happened. And that first single, actually due to her live TV performances, that blew up and they transferred the deal onto an album deal. And within 2 weeks, she went around in the UK working with the likes of Martin Offler, Terry Britton, different producers, different writers, and then that became the Private Dancer album that went on to sell 20, 30 million albums. So it started off as a kind of a one-off project to do a couple of tracks and ended up completely making her a superstar. She was always fantastic as a performer. Her performances just blew people away, and she just became, very credible again, and the rest is history. Sadly, she grew up with Ike. But if you want to take away the sort of the domestic or the personal side of Ike Turner and Tina Turner, Ike Turner was a musical genius. He played and recorded one of the first rock and roll records, Rocket 88. He was the A&R guy for Sun. He brought in a lot of artists, musically brilliant. And he was like the old school producer, musical director that, rehearsed for an hour before the show. It was that kind of perfection. But I think partly that's what helped build Tina Turner in terms of her performance and her ability to capture an audience, was that old school mentality of going out there back to back to back shows. And again, as I say, an hour and a half rehearsals before the show just to get things right. There's that discipline that she had grown up with Ike. So on a music level, he definitely was a big influence for her. So it was that sort of combination. But she was, you could tell, you'd walk on the stage and completely take over, have a complete command of the audience at any level, whether it was a club level or a stadium level. And some of the legendary artists are like that. They just have that ability to sort of, communicate to the audience as soon as they walk on stage. And it's David Bowie, the Jaggers of the world. I've seen it.
The EMI experience, how did that work out? A weekly contract, a monthly?
It was more project based. So EMI bought Virgin, so they owned the company, and then they decided to break down the labels. EMI had Capitol, they had Virgin, they had different subsidiary labels. And as the industry was changing in the late 90s, where digital was coming in, the manufacturing and distribution was going downhill. A lot of labels were really suffering, which is why it went from maybe 6 or 7 major labels to 3. Everyone decided to consolidate. So they decided to close Virgin as a label and just make it a subsidiary label. So I was still working with some projects that they wanted to work with, the likes of John Lee Hooker and other artists.
John Lee Hooker, man. I love that stuff. I wish we could really get Sammy excited about something that comes through where we're able to actually get a property moving in the right direction and make something that's a bigger visual sort of storyline with some of that whole era.
If I had listened what my dead old mother said,
I think there's always a market for this
Yeah.
musical drama that
Yeah.
is happening. A lot of visuals, a lot of shows,
Well,
a
you
lot
know,
of
the latest successful movie, Sinners, is all based on Clarksdale, Mississippi, Robert Johnson. You know, they use different names, you know, like Smokestack being the twins, but that's Smokestack Lightning as in Howling Wolf. So again, whether people knew the history of blues is been a very, very successful movie. Obviously, there's that sort of horror element thrown into it, but every so often projects can break from that depending on the vehicle. You know, I mean, a film can break a soundtrack of music that wouldn't normally be commercially accessible, but due to the film, it makes it accessible because it reaches a wide audience. And a lot of people who never go out and find that music get to hear it and like it.
no, it's a great publicity piece. It's like a vehicle for the whole license, for the whole
Oh, yeah.
intellectual property,
Yeah.
making more visuals, making more film, making
Yeah.
mixing it with the music side.
You know, there's two ways of doing it. Like with John Lee Hooker in the 80s was really a touring artist that no one really had any interest in investing in musically. And it was only his manager that decided that the best way maybe to promote him was to get people that were influenced by John Lee to come and record with him. So that's how the Healer album started, like, you know, Santana, Van Morrison, Bonnie Raitt. There's plenty of people that admired John Lee that were heavily influenced by him. So it was really by coupling very established, commercially successful artists with John Lee that accelerated him to a wider audience because these people would listen. So that became a trend where a lot of artists, whether it be Buddy Guy, they needed, sadly, the vehicle to sort of get them to a wider audience. And then from there, they would go on to sell records on their own. Or, as we mentioned, you know, getting music into a soundtrack where it's with visuals. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a great example of something.
Oh God, I love every
know,
part of that soundtrack.
Bluegrass, you know, music was, you know, Ralph Stanley never sold a lot of records, highly respected. But then that, you know, that soundtrack went on to do 6 million albums. Or even Shaft, if back in the days with Isaac Hayes, Shaft actually generated more money than the movie because the soundtrack just blew up. But it needed the movie to launch it, if you like. And then from there, once the interest was there in that music, it took off on its own. So often, you know, with more historic music, you need a newer vehicle to really bring it back to the masses because people don't really go and search for music as such. You've got to take it to a younger audience if you want to reach that audience. The younger audience isn't necessarily going to find you. So it's all about, you know, how do they find music, and whether it be through film, video, TikTok, or whatever. It's not to say they don't like it. I mean, 70% of all the sales on Spotify are all classic artists. They're not new. They're all classic. People do go back and hear Hendrix for the first time or Led Zeppelin, bands like that. And kids enjoy it just as someone did 30 years ago. But usually it takes some kind of vehicle to launch it again to the mainstream, if you're talking about large numbers.
So you were like a multi-hat cat coming in, consulting. You were curating probably music too, right?
I was doing compilations as well. The industry was really tough back then because it was going through a lot of transition. Labels were downsizing.
What year is that?
That was probably around year 2000 to 2005. That was the biggest transition. Late 90s was successful, and then it sort of went downhill where the majors were struggling because of sales. Digital was taken over. They originally rejected the digital world. They were holding on to physical as long as they could because it was the most profitable means. And eventually, then all the bootlegging of music online basically had to get the labels to sort of acknowledge it. iTunes was launched, and you know, that then became the standard download. So then it became selling tracks as opposed to albums, and that changed considerably the world.
We're here now, 2025.
Yeah.
What's next?
I don't know where it's going. I just worry about the saturation because labels were the filter. You know, we as an industry would decide what is worthy of investment, whether we were wrong or right, because there was a lot of records signed that never were successful. But at least there was a filter. Then there was development of that artist. So when the audience heard it, when the consumer heard it, It had already gone through that process. You wouldn't get a record deal if you weren't of a certain standard. Like you don't get to the NBA unless you're one of the top collegiate players. So there was a kind of a filter system. Now there's no filter. So you're dealing with all areas of music, all different standards. The younger generation doesn't listen to music as we might have listened to it, where, the album was what you bought and invested in. You hung out with your friends, you shared it. There's so many different things now for kids to look at. They don't sit and listen to music. Music's a part of the media they might listen to or watch, but it's not the same. Having said that, there's always an audience.
So where is the opportunity in that?
It's not who you know anymore, it's who knows you. So if you don't have an awareness or social media, and this applies to major labels to independents. I mean, I've worked with new bands on majors, and they expect the artists to do a lot of that groundwork themselves. Every day, put up 2 or 3 posts on Instagram, be visible, be relevant. Influencers, for example, have probably got more chance of getting a deal than a musician, because they're already got a huge audience.
That part of it is kind of the demise right there. But then you have the fact that there's still money in events. There's still money in concerts.
That's where the money's generated, is merch and concerts. That's the thing that amazes me, because I look at festivals, and to be honest with you, I couldn't even tell you anything about the top headliners, let alone, the artists further down on the list. And then I go to Spotify and I see they've done, 100 million streams. They've got 2 million followers. And that's why they're headlining festivals, because in itself, that's not generating a lot of money through streaming. But once they've gained that audience, they can sell a ticket, or they can sell merch.
And I don't think that's dead. I don't think it's going to die, because I think still in the performance aspect of it is a valuable thing. And you're
100%.
talking about going to the next level. The technologists out there who can create. It's not the same as the person that's going to be in front of thousands of people.
It builds loyalty and it builds longevity.
You're starting a bank, like it's the beginning of that push, that drive, that journey to actually create a company where you're making money as an artist.
If you're a good touring artist, that keeps your visibility out there, and that helps a lot.
That's still relevant.
Music's very disposable. The audience doesn't commit anymore. There's not a lot of loyalty to any one artist. There are exceptions, obviously.
You can have a brain center anywhere you want it, and you have a team that goes out with you, and it's a traveling show.
You look at this Taylor Swift tour. I mean, they turn performances into film, into video, but but that's taken years and years to establish that kind of following.
The business side of logistically handling all that needs to be done, and that's important to have that management, the right management.
In the day, you would sign a band, and they were 1 minute they were unknown, next minute they'd have people running after them in the street. But that was all due to the success of the record, the single being a hit on radio or whatever. And now, as I say, there's a lot of artists that are very successful, but I don't know how that relates to financial success, because you can do 1 million streams on Spotify and you're making a couple of grand.
There is this intrinsic value of great music, like somebody who can really play great music. It's like a magician. It's a wand.
No,
it's a
100%. I think now musicians are transcending back to being more authentic, as in playing instruments again, as opposed to just technology and building tracks.
They have to work together. It is where it is.
Well, it's also just cost, right? Because people don't have recording budgets anymore, but the technology allows them to make records cheaply and efficiently. They're good. Where before you had to go into a recording studio, that was a lot of money, which is why you needed a label to back you.
Pop Staples, he seems like a fun guy.
The thing that I always remember about Pops really was just the stories that he would tell, because, he and the girls, the Staples singers, when Mavis was 17, I mean, they toured with Dr. Franklin, who's Aretha Franklin's dad, and they would go out on tour supporting Martin Luther King when he was doing his speeches. So the Staples would play gospel prior to that, and just stories about that, and just hard times traveling around the South.
So he was a warrior for civil rights in a sense. Definitely,
Oh,
he was
big time, yeah.
Part of that whole movement, and he was fearless.
He and King were really good friends, and I say that the whole Aretha their background was touring in gospel. They all made gospel records before they crossed over and did more mainstream stuff. Staples were on VJ out of Indiana, and Aretha was on Columbia doing straight gospel, not mainstream until she signed to another label. But I guess it was more the stories and the experience of what it was like as a musician back then, of dealing with being on the road, some of the adversity that they had to put up with, just all of that, as well as the recording when they were on Stax, and or hearing about what Stax, the biggest soul festival back in '71, just being involved in all that kind of stuff was pretty awesome. We had a lot of fun recording together actually in Memphis. Why Am I Treated So Bad was the song that he played for Martin Luther King about a few days before he was assassinated.
Oh,
So there were songs that had strong connections with pops that he wanted to redo. And then Mavis was obviously involved in the recordings, although it's a Pop Staples solo album. The girls were all on it. So working with Mavis was pretty incredible back then. And we were working with Willie Mitchell, who had a studio in Memphis, High Records. And, Willie was famous for signing and producing Al Green and Ann Peebles. So that was an experience working with the Staples in Willie Mitchell's studio and hanging out with Willie Mitchell, who is also a character. And again, for me, it was just like history lessons.
Where creators and disruptors meet. LA Live with Ron Colbert takes you inside the minds of entrepreneurs, artists, and technologists. Subscribe and like now.